Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, investors publicly distance themselves from Saudi Arabia after the disappearance of a journalist sparks an international outcry. We examine what that means for the kingdom's economic ambitions. Also this week, the future of food, the new technology trying to shape agriculture. Plus, sunshine and souks. Tunisia's tourism industry is back in business. Now, the alleged killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at his country's consulate in Istanbul has shocked the world. Saudi Arabia is under intense pressure to explain what happened. The world's largest oil exporter could face international sanctions. Well, the cost of insuring against Saudi default has increased 32%. That means investors view the country as a much riskier bet now. The government may now be forced to raise more debt at a higher cost. It's already running a budget deficit. The Saudi government is trying to court investment for new cities and projects. Big names in business and finance ministers, including US Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, are boycotting a key investment event. The conference is scheduled to run from October the 23rd to the 25th. Rob Matheson reports.
Only last week, Christine Lagarde, the head of the International Monetary Fund, said she was still going to Saudi Arabia, even though she was horrified at the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Now her office says her trip is being deferred. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, has also pulled out. It's had 85 years of business in Saudi Arabia. It began by helping US oil firms start up there. Stephen Schwarzman, chief executive of Blackstone, isn't going either. He's said to have been one of the first Western financiers to actively court Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Bill Ford of the Ford Motor Company's pulled out too. He's blaming a scheduling conflict. Ford was hoping to boost sales after Saudi Arabian women were allowed to drive. Media companies including CNBC, Financial Times, CNN and the New York Times have also withdrawn. So have some banks including HSBC, BNP Paribas and Société Générale. Some countries have said they won't now be sending trade delegations. But it's important to remember this. Just because key individuals might not be going, that doesn't guarantee their organizations or their countries won't be represented. US Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin and the multinational conglomerate SoftBank chose to wait before making a decision. This conference was a chance for the Saudis to resuscitate business confidence, which has been slacking off in certain sectors for months. Some investors may now need a lot of persuading.
Well, joining me here in Doha is Laurent Lambert. Laurent is a senior policy analyst at Qatar University's Social and Economic Survey Research Institute. Good to have you with us. So I guess the reason why the Saudi economy's risk profile is rising is because of underlying fears that it might be about to be hit by sanctions or some kind of punitive measures. How likely is that scenario to you?
Only time will tell if there are sanctions. If there are sanctions, that would be terrible for the plans of the young crown prince.
Now, whether sanctions are imposed or not, in a sense, has the damage already been done to investor confidence in Saudi Arabia?
To a great deal, because this is not just the first case that can disrupt the confidence that investors had towards Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia. A year ago, a number of prominent businessmen and Saudi royal family members were arrested in a corruption crackdown. The problem is that there was little transparency, no real trials, and at the end of the day, people believed that this was a form of extortion. So how people could believe in the judicial system of Saudi Arabia, that's also a concern for investors. And then there were spats with Germany at low profile, higher profile, a spat with Canada over human rights, and now there is this latest news which doesn't bode well to lure investments.
How justified then are fears that the oil market might be dragged into this, given what you're saying?
Well, you know, the oil market is always a market which is very reactive to news, for good or worse, generally for worse. There are speculators, especially very active on the oil market, and generally when a bad news happens, geopolitical news, for instance, it does affect negatively the oil market, meaning the oil price increases. This is something the Trump administration doesn't want to see coming. They've been very adamant, very insisting very strongly towards the Saudis and other oil producers that they want to have more production to cool down the prices. But the contrary might happen if sanctions were imposed.
Analysts have interpreted some of the Saudi measures as an indication that they are willing to use the oil card should things get messy, shall we say, in economic ties or sanctions. How realistic do you think that card could really be used by Riyadh?
Well, we need to distinguish two things. The willingness to express, to show we are strong, to show that we can retaliate if we are, meaning the Saudis are to receive sanctions, so that they are very clear about that. They want to show that they are not a small country that can be bullied, but at the same time, they don't want to disrupt any global economy.
Because it could backfire on them too.
Exactly. They are completely depending for their oil exports, which is their key source of foreign currencies.
Do you think?
There is a fair share of bluff, but you know, this is diplomacy.
So some investors have already pulled out. So what about the Saudi investment conference, the so-called Davos of the desert? To what extent is that being impacted by the Khashoggi affair?
Well, we have seen a number of people who had to come, who cancelled in a series of people cancelling their coming. So this made the news, and this is not good for business, of course. At the same time, the conference has its own domestic and regional audience, so it was not completely depending on these essentially Western investors, but it's a setback for the Saudi economy, definitely.
Will it translate into actual, a drying up of deal-making, a slowing down of FDI acceleration into Saudi Arabia, or will business just go on as normal?
Well, but that's the problem. Business as normal is the problem. The Saudi crown prince wanted to show he could boost the Saudi economy, that it could go beyond oil, real estate, and big infrastructure construction, that it could trigger investors to kickstart a knowledge economy, to kickstart an industry of robots, especially to build its touristic city. But all that seems in jeopardy because this needs fresher capital, not just recycling the oil rent, but having investors from abroad, from the West, from China and Japan coming. This is less promising now.
So given what you're saying, where does that leave Vision 2030 then?
Well, might happen in 2050. More seriously, I think that for now the momentum is not there. So they are very unlikely to have the kind of diversification the way it is now. They are very unlikely to have the kind of diversification they aspire to.
Will they have to raise more debt then to fund some of these 2030 projects?
That could be a solution.
Where will that leave the deficit, the budget deficit, though?
Well, that's the main concern, because especially this year, they have a significant budget deficit already. So this would not be a good sign also for investors, because that threatens the currency. And so people, for now, don't know if the macroeconomic indicators of Saudi Arabia will stay stable enough. So many investors are waiting and seeing, and for now, the diversification strategy is not on track.
A lot of tech companies are funded by Saudi money, aren't they? Is that going to continue after this, or does Saudi money become something sort of suspect now?
Well, there are two things. There is investments from technology companies into Saudi Arabia. That's what is frozen. But money coming from Saudi Arabia will always be welcome on the market, yes. So be it the Silicon Valley, be it in Eastern Asia also, where there are some companies that are receiving a lot of investments. This will keep on going. But the concern, again, is that the diversification is not happening.
And has the Khashoggi affair, do you think, pushed the any Aramco listing even further back into the horizon?
I don't think we can link the two things. The Saudi Aramco IPO was already stalled for a number of reasons. Some are technical, some are more political. Technical reasons, well, there is no transparency as to the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. They've for long exaggerated how much oil there is in their reserves. And now to disclose it, to disclose the real reserves, because for an IPO you need transparency, This is the main problem. And on the political side, making transparency, giving more transparency on how the money from the oil is spent, that's a major issue.
All right, Laurent, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Sami.
Some other stories on our radar this week. China could be facing a debt iceberg. That's according to S&P Global. The ratings agency is highlighting what it called titanic credit risks because of underreported local government debt. Meanwhile, the world's #2 economy reported its slowest quarterly growth rate since the global financial crisis. Brexit time out. European Union leaders have given themselves several more weeks to reach a break-up deal with the UK. Talks this week failed to deliver a hoped-for breakthrough. Plus, better than expected earnings at Netflix helped its shares higher this week. The streaming video service added 7 million new customers in the 3 months to September. 137 million people globally now use Netflix. Still to come on Counting the Cost. On a high, Canada becomes the world's largest legal marijuana marketplace. But first, Tunisia is enjoying a tourism revival. The industry had gone into decline following a series of attacks by armed groups on visitors in 2015. Mohammed Val has the story.
Tunisia's tourism industry is taking off. The sandy beaches of Sousse in the northeast are again bustling. Soufiane Baklouti is the general manager of Sibel Hotel. All 480 beds are fully booked, even though the hot season has ended.
In 2017, we started to feel like European tourists are coming back. And in 2018, there was a remarkable increase in European tourism, especially Western European tourists, classic markets like Belgian, English, Swiss, Luxembourgers, and also French.
Scenes like these have not been seen since early 2011 for the uprising that toppled former President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali. That triggered a series of popular revolts in the region known as the Arab Spring. As in all Arab Spring nations, Tunisia paid a hefty price for the sudden political upheaval. Armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL staged attacks across the country. The bloodiest was on the Bardo Museum in the capital Tunis in March 2015 that killed 22 people, 20 of them European tourists. The attacks led to a severe drop in visitor numbers, hitting the country's economy.
We can say that the hot season has ended, but autumn season is excellent as well, and there are still lots of hotels which will be full for October and early November. It was positive, and statistics are here to confirm that.
But that situation began to change early in 2017, with a marked improvement this year. Nearly 5.5 million tourists have arrived since January, and major European operators, including Thomas Cook and TUI, have resumed holidays to Tunisia. The government says it expects visitor numbers to hit a record 8 million by the end of the year. For Tunisians, tourism means not only economic ease, but also peace, a feeling shared by those arriving in the country.
Safe, yes, of course, I'm safe in Tunisia. I like Tunisia very much. The people are very kind here. Old culture, good food. I like it very much.
The bazaars in Sousse and elsewhere are testament to the changed atmosphere. Handicraft sellers are again busy, all hoping that the bad times are over for good.
The UN's Food and Agriculture Agency says the world will need to change the way it produces its food in order to cater to an increasing global population. Emma Hayward went to Scotland to look at an alternative approach to farming.
There's no tractor or trailer or reliance on the sun or the rain. Instead, special lighting is helping this crop of basil and dill to grow. This is the UK's first fully automated vertical farm, where the vents built into the trays pump the right amount of air to regulate the temperature and humidity.
We've taken a field, we've cut it into tray-sized pieces about 6.5 square metres, and as you can see behind me, we've stacked them up on top of each other. Then we've put them in a box, and we've made the weather inside the box. So we've made our own sunshine, we've made our own rain, we've made our own wind, we can heat, we can cool, we can deal with humidity.
Under this system being developed in Scotland, crops can grow quickly using 97% less water than normally would be used. This method of farming isn't being seen as a replacement for more traditional methods of agriculture, but it could be useful in areas where it's difficult to grow crops and where the climate is extreme. And changing the way we produce food will be vital in the future. The UN is warning that by 2050, the global population will be more than 9 billion and will need to produce 70% more food to feed everyone.
This technology allows us to grow food in areas of the world where it's very difficult because of the climate, or in areas of the world where there's actually very little land available. So it changes the whole food system supply chain, for example, but also seriously reduces the amount of energy and inputs that we have to put into making food.
Here, they're aiming to be energy neutral. As the demands of our population increase, so too will our need for innovation.
Well, joining me now from Amsterdam is Adam Anders. Adam is a co-founder and managing partner at Entera Capital. Good to have you with us. So, can the world produce enough food for 9 billion people? That's the big concern going forward. Where do you think we're heading?
You know, I think if it's just about delivering calories, there is enough land around the world and probably enough resourceful people. I think the problem is where that food has to be, whether it's nutritious enough and whether it's affordable.
What exactly is agtech?
So for us, agtech is the adoption of new ideas, new technologies, be it digital, biotech, material sciences, applied to any aspect of the food and agriculture value chain. And that works from the stage of breeding to pesticides, on-farm practices, transportation, shelf life, logistics.
All right, give us some examples, though, some practical examples of what a normal farm that's converted into agtech, how does it look different?
So, for example, if we're dealing at the farm level, you could, first of all, what ag inputs the farmer might choose. So the genetics, the actual performance of the plant. How do we know that that plant is suitable for that soil? How do we know that the right amount of that seed is going to be used? And then from there, once you've actually made your planting decision, how can you use data in order to be more precise, both about that first moment of planting and then how to treat that plant as it grows. Then we go through that treatment process with different forms of pesticide, fungicide, herbicide, traditionally an area where some quite brutal chemicals have been used, and it's time for the next generation. And then it's harvesting time. How do we record that yield? How can the farmer best market that product? And digital or biotech solutions are available to help every aspect of that for the farmer.
Okay, but listening to you there, one wonders, are we talking about a system of farming that really requires a fundamental, maybe complicated set of changes to the whole process of farming?
You know, I don't think so. And also farmers can adopt it in different degrees. So if it's just a better performing seed in a saline soil or in a low moisture environment, that's something that could be distributed anywhere in the world and just help productivity and yields. You can also go very high tech and be analysing your farm, not even at the field level, but at the plant level eventually, maybe. So I think that's going to be up to the farmer.
Is there enough investment going on then in agtech? Because it sounds great.
The investment activity has moved from, let's say, 5 years ago, practically non-existent. So globally, when we started looking at agtech 10 years ago, it was 300 million globally invested per year in one of the largest sectors in the earth. These days, we're looking in the billions. At agtech alone, probably 3 to 4 billion last year. If you include food tech, some people say 10 billion. So it's definitely growing. Is it enough? That I'm not sure about yet.
What about developing countries? Will they be left behind the agtech revolution if they're not able to put as much money as others into the game?
I personally think some of the best opportunities for improvement are in emerging countries, and also some of the best opportunities for getting a return on that application of technology for entrepreneurs. And that's in part because we've got a very big yield gap. In developed countries, farmers are achieving 70, sometimes 80% of yield potential. In emerging markets, it's often 30%. Another key reason would be we're seeing a step change in technology where you don't have to go through the farming practices that have helped emerging developed markets, but arguably these days are holding them back a bit. And that links to my third reason why it's going to be great for emerging markets. There's less arrogance about how to farm, and there's more openness to some of these suggestions than we see in farmers in, say, the Netherlands taking advice on how to do dairy when they've been world leaders for 400 years in that sector.
I like the point there about how you touched upon an issue, or you made me think of an issue there when you said there'll be less arrogant. How different will the farmer of the future look like then compared to now? Because when you say farmer, you kind of think of a chap in a field with raking the field. Will the farmer instead be sitting on a computer with big data and doing statistical manipulations or something like that?
Look, I definitely don't think a computer is part of the answer. Farmers will always want to be in the field and be close to their plants, their animals, their land, and there's a big part of that that's a part. I grew up on a farm. That's a part of being a farmer. But using your smartphone or an iPad in order to prioritize what to do that day, to know more specificity where there might be disease pressure, how you can more accurately apply a pesticide or look after your field, and actually farming at that more detailed level will be helped by technology. I'm quite certain of it.
Will we be 3D printing our food, for example, though?
Look, I think that's a different solution in a different data set, and it's possible that 3D printing will help food, but I don't see that as a fundamental revolution in the same way of what I see happening on the farm. I do think it's a novel idea, and I think it'll solve perhaps some transportation issues, some ingredient issues, and certainly it can be a lot of fun in terms of different flavors, textures, and everything else that we're seeing in high-end restaurants.
All right, thanks so much for coming and talking to us about that.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And finally, Canada has joined the very exclusive club of countries that allows the sale of recreational marijuana. After Uruguay, it's only the second country to do so. Daniel Lack reports from Toronto.
One hand in the sky right now. I can't see you. We are minutes away from legalization right here in Canada.
Illegal no more. At midnight in the easternmost time zone, the first non-medicinal cannabis is sold without breaking Canadian law.
Feels great. Wouldn't you be super happy too if you were the first person in line?
Legalization is being celebrated countrywide and not just by smokers. Canadian cannabis companies have seen their share prices soar in recent months as the big day approached.
There's not one client that I have met yet that has not been touched by the introduction of cannabis in Canada. Life sciences, technology, the banking industry, retailers, but in addition to food and beverage companies, you're going to start seeing a lot of activity as they touch the cannabis market.
How Canadians buy their cannabis depends on where they live. There will be different distribution rules in each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. Some will have government-run online and real stores, others private retail. Prices will also differ. Some critics say that puts too many restrictions on an activity most Canadians have long wanted to be legal.
We can't really stop it with prohibition. We better call it legalization. Unfortunately, the government has tried to maintain all of the details of prohibition and just call it legalizations.
Legalizing cannabis fulfills a campaign promise made in 2015 by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who himself admitted several years ago that he was an occasional user in the past. The government is also offering pardons to people convicted of possession now that the drug is legal. Because cannabis has been outlawed for so long, its effects on mind and body are being studied in detail at this Toronto medical lab. They're using a simulator to see how drivers who've smoked a joint react to virtual traffic conditions. Police and road safety advisors are also part of the research.
The most important thing is for drivers to understand what's going on in their bodies and prevent things from happening. I think everybody's interested in keeping our roads safer, so we'll help drivers to maintain that safety.
Polls show most Canadians are not opposed to legal cannabis so long as it can be kept away from children, and the multi-billion-dollar profits from an industry once dominated by organized crime can be taxed and used to benefit society.
Well, that's our show for this week, but remember you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.